In the twilight of the ancient world, when the Roman Empire had crumbled into dust, a new era of conflict emerged, one that would shape the course of history in ways unimaginable at the time. The chaotic transition from the fall of great empires to the birth of feudal societies left a vacuum, a brutal emptiness filled only by the raw power of arms. Gone were the grand armies of Rome, with their shining legions and disciplined formations. What replaced them was a world where survival meant fighting not just against armies, but against an ever-present sense of disorder. The early medieval battlefield was a place of terror, a cacophony of clashing metal, desperate cries, and the screams of those caught in the chaos. Armies were not the well-organized units we might imagine from later centuries. Instead, they were a patchwork of warriors, many with little more than a sword or an axe to defend themselves. Armor, if it existed, was rudimentary and offered little protection against the brutal forces of nature and battle. Those who fought had no concept of modern warfare. There were no drills, no tactics, only the primal instinct to survive. The early combatants fought not just against enemies, but against fear itself. For many, battle was a test of endurance more than strength. It was about enduring the physical toll, the unrelenting fatigue, the fear, the injuries that could leave a warrior incapacitated or worse, dead. Imagine the feeling of stepping onto a battlefield, knowing that death could come from any direction, not just from an opponent's sword, but from the crushing weight of the battlefield itself. There was no mercy, no honor, only the constant struggle to survive the violence and chaos. What if these warriors had no idea how to win? Or worse, if they fought simply to stay alive for another day? Imagine how it must have felt to face a wall of enemies with nothing but a blade in hand, uncertain of whether your strength would last through the blood-soaked madness. In those moments, nothing was certain. One wrong move, and life as you knew it could end. But there were no answers, only the endless march forward, carried by adrenaline and fear. A world where every battle was not just a war for territory, but a personal fight for survival, moment by moment. This chaos would evolve. With time, soldiers would learn, adapt, and be shaped by the realities of medieval conflict. But for those in the early days, every clash was a new chapter in an unforgiving story of violence. In the midst of the violence and chaos of early medieval warfare, the true cost of battle often went unnoticed by those who weren't directly involved. But the soldiers, those who marched into the fray, could never forget the toll it took on them. Battle was not just a physical test, it was a mental one, a trial of the human spirit. No one left a battlefield untouched. Whether a victor or a casualty, each warrior carried the scars of combat, not only the ones visible to the eye, but those buried deep inside, often forever. For the soldiers, the toll of war went beyond the wounds that could be treated, or the injuries that would eventually heal. What of the wounds that no one could see? The terror of the battlefield lingered in their minds long after the dust had settled. Men returned to their homes, to their families, only to find that they were strangers in their own lives. The psychological scars, like invisible chains, bound them to a past they could never escape. Those who survived were often left to grapple with memories that would haunt them for the rest of their days. The psychological toll of battle, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, was unknown to the warriors of the time. There were no counselors, no understanding of the mental effects of war, only the expectation that men would return to their lives as if nothing had changed. But how could they? How could one return to a peaceful village after hearing the screams of the dying and feeling the weight of a weapon that had taken so many lives? The answer was that they couldn't. The mind was forever altered by the horrors it had witnessed. Yet, this was only one side of the story. For the civilians who lived on the outskirts of these battlefields, the cost of war was equally devastating. Though they were not armed, they were often the first to feel the effects of an army's advance. When an army marched through their villages, it brought not just death but the loss of everything they held. Dear homes burned to the ground, families torn apart. The invaders did not fight only for land, They fought to break the will of the people, to leave them in a state of fear and despair that would last for generations. Perhaps the most chilling reality was that survivors, whether soldiers or civilians, often found themselves alone in a world that had no place for them. The brutality of the battlefield left behind nothing but destruction, and the soldiers who survived it, those who managed to live through the endless violence and carnage, were left to rebuild lives from the broken fragments of their past. And yet, in the depths of this suffering, something else emerged, a sort of resilience. Those who survived learned how to continue, not out of hope, but simply out of the necessity of life. But survival came at a cost that could never truly be measured. It's a cost that, even today, continues to echo in the hearts and minds of those who understand the deep, enduring price of war. From here, the focus would shift toward how medieval soldiers and civilians adapted to the brutality they lived through, how they found ways to arm themselves, and how strategies began to emerge, forming the backbone of the warriors and commanders who would come after. A new chapter in the story of medieval warfare was about to unfold. In the savage world of medieval warfare, a warrior's survival often hinged on the simplest of tools. A sword, a shield, a spear, these were not mere objects. They were lifelines, extensions of the body, and emblems of identity. The battlefield was a place where these weapons were not just tools of death, but expressions of the very essence of survival. To wield them meant understanding not only their function but their weight, their power, and their fatality. The longsword, with its double-edged blade, was perhaps the most iconic weapon of the era. It was a weapon of balance, designed for both cutting and thrusting, capable of felling an opponent in a single strike. But to wield such a weapon required more than just strength. It demanded skill, agility, and the ability to adapt to the chaos of the battlefield. A poorly executed blow could leave a soldier vulnerable, while a well-placed strike could change the course of a battle. Imagine the feel of the hilt in your hand, the weight of the steel, the hum of the air as the blade sliced through it. It was an experience like no other, where life and death were determined in the blink of an eye. But the sword was only part of the equation. The shield, too, played a vital role in survival. In the face of an oncoming attack, it was not just a piece of metal or wood. It was the difference between life and death. A soldier's shield was his first line of defense, absorbing blows and deflecting deadly strikes. Yet, this shield wasn't just a passive object. It was actively engaged in the fight, carried with purpose, and often wielded in conjunction with the sword. Imagine the weight on your arm as you raised the shield, bracing against the impact of a mace or the swing of an axe. The shield was more than just protection. It was a symbol of resilience, of standing firm against the storm of battle. Then, there was the spear, simple yet devastatingly effective. Longer than a sword, it allowed soldiers to engage their enemies from a distance, giving them the ability to strike from behind the safety of a shield wall. The spear was a weapon of reach and precision, and its power was in its versatility. Whether used in formation or individually, it could pierce armor, strike through gaps in defenses, or keep an opponent at bay. In the hands of a trained soldier, the spear was an extension of his will, a silent force of destruction. What did it feel like to face an enemy with only these tools? There was no safety net, no sophisticated armor or technology to rely on. It was a fight to the death, where the strength of your weapon was the key to your survival, but it was also the cost of your life. Every swing of the sword, every thrust of the spear, every defensive move with the shield, carried with it the potential for both victory and doom. The weight of these weapons, their impact, their blood-stained legacy, each one played a role in shaping the medieval battlefield. Yet, they were only one piece of the larger puzzle. The soldiers who wielded them faced not just the weapons of their enemies but the physical toll of carrying them. And in the next chapter, we'll explore how armor, designed to protect, often became a burden that shaped the outcome of the battles in unexpected ways. In the world of medieval combat, armor was both a savior and a curse. For the soldier, it was a life-preserving force, a barrier between their fragile body and the harsh, unforgiving weapons of war. Yet, while armor provided protection, it also introduced an entirely new set of challenges, a set of limitations that could be as deadly as the enemies on the battlefield. The weight of the steel, the limited mobility, and the psychological burden of constant vigilance all played a part in shaping the experience of medieval warriors. The first type of armor many soldiers wore was chainmail, a long shirt made of interwoven metal rings. The flexible design allowed for some movement, while offering a basic level of protection against slashes and stabs. However, chainmail wasn't perfect. While it could stop a sword strike, it was far less effective against blunt force or thrusts from a spear. The weight of the mail could also drain a soldier's stamina, especially in long battles where every swing of the sword or every step felt heavier than the last. But for all its faults, chainmail was an improvement over the simple leather tunic soldiers wore before. It was a vital step in the evolution of armor. As warfare became more brutal and weapons grew deadlier, armor had to evolve. Enter plate armor, the crowning achievement of medieval protection. Plate armor covered the entire body in polished metal, from the head to the toes. Its design was intended to deflect blows rather than absorb them, creating an almost impenetrable wall of steel. The weight of full plate armor could exceed 50 pounds, and it required a soldier to be in peak physical condition just to wear it. Imagine the pressure of carrying that weight into battle, the limited range of motion, and the exhaustion that set in long before the first battle cry. But here lay the paradox. The very armor that protected a soldier could also seal their fate. A knight encased in plate armor was protected from most strikes, but the weight of the armor made him sluggish, vulnerable to the cunning tactics of lighter, faster enemies. A knight could be trapped, immobile, unable to defend himself if caught in the wrong position. Worse still, if a knight fell to the ground, he could be rendered helpless, unable to rise, his heavy armor anchoring him in place like a tomb. In many ways, plate armor symbolized the paradox of medieval warfare. It offered the promise of safety and survival, but it also came with its own set of dangers. A soldier in full armor was both protected and encumbered, strong and weak. It was a delicate balance between life and death, and the outcome often depended on how well the warrior could navigate that balance on the chaotic, blood-soaked battlefield. As armor continued to evolve, so did the battlefield tactics. Soldiers with heavy plate armor became less mobile, relying on formations and strategies that minimized their vulnerabilities. The next section will delve into the role of these tactics, how commanders learned to use terrain, formations, and psychological warfare to turn the tide of battle, creating a new set of rules for warfare. The brutality of medieval warfare was not just defined by the weapons and armor used by the soldiers. It was also shaped by the strategies and tactics deployed by commanders. While individual weapons were powerful, it was often the way they were used in concert, the way armies moved and interacted with the terrain, that decided the fate of entire battles. The tactical genius of commanders, their understanding of terrain, and their manipulation of the enemy's psychology played just as significant a role in determining the outcome of battles as the weapons themselves. Consider the role of the cavalry in medieval warfare. Mounted knights, often the heaviest and most heavily armored soldiers on the battlefield, were used for shock tactics, charging into enemy lines with devastating force. The sight of a group of knights galloping toward an opposing army, their lances held high, could break a line of infantry before a single sword was swung, but cavalry had to be used wisely. If they charged without proper formation or in unfavorable terrain, they could become vulnerable to archers or spearmen, who were trained to counter mounted attacks. The key to success lay in the timing when to strike, where to strike, and how to create a breakthrough that would send the enemy into disarray. The use of archers and long-range weapons also played a critical role in the success or failure of a battle. Unlike cavalry, archers were light, mobile, and could be used to harry the enemy from a distance. In many battles, archers were positioned at the front lines to shower arrows down upon the enemy, weakening their morale and causing chaos before the main forces engaged. The sight of arrows raining down could demoralize enemy troops, especially if they were poorly trained or not used to such tactics. Archers also created psychological pressure, forcing the enemy to stay in constant motion, never sure where the next deadly projectile would land. Then there were the infantry, the backbone of any medieval army. These soldiers were less mobile than cavalry, but often had the advantage of forming tight, cohesive units that could withstand mounted charges. The use of the shield wall, where soldiers stood side by side with their shields locked together, was a powerful defensive tactic. The wall protected the soldiers from arrows, spears, and cavalry charges, while allowing them to fight as a unit, coordinating their attacks with precision. However, the shield wall had its weaknesses. If a unit's cohesion broke, the wall could collapse, and the soldiers inside were at the mercy of the enemy. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval warfare was the use of psychological tactics. It wasn't just about fighting, it was about breaking the enemy's spirit. The sight of the enemy's banners, the sound of war drums, the terrifying charge of cavalry. These were all tools used to instill fear and confusion. The mind played a powerful role on the battlefield. A single command from a leader could turn the tide of an entire engagement. Whether it was a sudden retreat to lure the enemy into an ambush or a well-timed rally to inspire soldiers, the psychological warfare tactics employed were just as lethal as any sword or spear. The next chapter will explore the cost of command, the weight of leadership on the battlefield. How did commanders make decisions that could mean life or death for thousands of soldiers? How did their understanding of tactics shape the course of history? The answers may not be as clear as we think, but they're waiting to be uncovered in the shadows of medieval warfare. In the chaos of medieval warfare, the men leading armies were not just commanders, they were burdened with the weight of life and death. Imagine standing at the front, gazing upon the battlefield stretching before you, knowing that every decision you made could determine the fate of thousands. The burden of command was a psychological strain that few could truly understand unless they had borne it themselves. A commander in medieval times didn't simply issue orders, they carried the responsibility for their soldiers' lives. They were not gods, nor did they possess the luxury of perfect knowledge. They were, however, expected to make life and death decisions under extreme pressure. Every battlefield decision, whether to advance, retreat, or fight for another hour, had consequences. One wrong move could lead to the destruction of entire armies. What must it have felt like to stand before your men, knowing that your choice would send them into a storm of blood and chaos? As the commander, you were expected to manage not just the physical risks of battle, but the very morale of your troops. The psychological weight of leadership was immense. Fear was contagious. If a commander faltered in the face of danger, it spread like wildfire through the ranks. Soldiers looked to their leaders for strength, for the unwavering presence that would guide them through the uncertainty of war. But what happens when that strength begins to waver? When the fear of failure or the pressure of responsibility becomes overwhelming? The dilemma faced by commanders was not just tactical, it was moral. The question was always there. Should you risk the lives of your men in a desperate charge, or should you retreat, saving them for another day, knowing that the enemy might gain ground, and your kingdom could be lost forever? Every decision was a test of character. Those who hesitated could lose the loyalty of their men, but those who acted recklessly could cause irreparable damage to their forces. There was no simple answer, no path that could guarantee victory. The men who held the reins of command walked a precarious line, balancing the lives of their soldiers against the demands of their rulers and the threats from their enemies. The pressure could break even the strongest minds. And sometimes, it did. The cost of command wasn't just measured in battle victories or defeats. It was measured in sleepless nights, in moments of doubt, and in the lingering fear that their decisions had led their men to slaughter. The burden of command was a curse that shaped history, one decision at a time. As the battlefield tactics began to evolve and the consequences of leadership became even more apparent, we turn our focus next to those who were directly impacted by these decisions, the soldiers themselves. The The psychological weight of warfare didn't stop at the commander's tent. It followed the soldiers into battle, shaping them in ways no weapon could. While commanders were burdened with the weight of life and death, the soldiers who fought in medieval warfare experienced their own psychological battles. The horrors of war reached deep into their hearts and minds, leaving scars that were far more lasting than any physical injury. But what was it really like to be a soldier, facing the unknown, gripped by fear, and yet forced to push forward with each advance? Imagine the overwhelming sense of dread that crept in as the first sounds of battle began: shouts, the clang of weapons, the thunder of hooves. What was it like to step onto the battlefield, knowing that you were about to face an army bent on your destruction? The psychological toll of war was far beyond just fear of death. It was the fear of failure, of letting down your comrades, of being crushed under the weight of expectation. Yet, despite the fear, soldiers found a kind of strength in camaraderie. They fought not just for victory, but for each other. In the chaos of the battlefield, amidst the screams and the bloodshed, a brotherhood formed. In the heat of battle, soldiers looked to their comrades for reassurance, for strength. It was a bond that went beyond the fear of death, one that could only be forged in the crucible of war. This brotherhood was the glue that held soldiers together in the face of unspeakable horrors. It was the knowledge that, no matter what happened, they were not alone. But as much as the camaraderie gave them strength, it also brought its own burden. The survivor's guilt, the sorrow of losing a comrade, these emotions would stay with them long after the battle was over. The grief didn't fade. Instead, it lingered in the back of their minds, a constant reminder of the price they paid for survival. Those who had seen their friends fall, who had watched them die with no chance of rescue, carried a weight that no one else could understand. The mental toll of war was insidious. It wasn't just about the fear of being killed. It was the trauma that came from the violence of battle. What does it feel like to kill, to take a life in the heat of combat? How does a soldier cope with the constant violence, the brutalizing sights and sounds, the smell of blood and death? Over time, this could break even the most hardened warriors, leaving them with an emptiness, a hollow space where once there was purpose. The fear and the trauma, the guilt and the grief, shaped every soldier who walked off the battlefield. Medieval warriors were not simply men of arms. They were men deeply altered by their experiences, by the things they had seen and done. These emotional scars left a permanent mark, affecting their relationships, their ability to reintegrate into civilian life, and sometimes even their sanity. As the soldiers battled with their minds, the consequences of the war did not stop on the battlefield. What happened when the fighting was over? What happened to those who survived the horrors of combat but were left to deal with the aftermath? After the clamour of battle fades and the last sword is sheathed, a new kind of horror takes hold, one that is quieter but just as deadly. The aftermath of medieval warfare was filled with grim realities, not just for the soldiers but for entire societies. The bodies of the fallen, the wounded, and the psychological wounds that could never heal lingered long after the battle cries had been silenced. For the soldiers who survived, there was no celebration. Instead, there was only the heavy burden of recovery, both physical and mental. The wounds they carried were not always visible. The deep gashes and broken bones were only a small part of the cost of war. The mental scars, the trauma of what they had seen and done, were invisible but often far more damaging. How did a soldier return to the world he once knew, knowing that he was forever changed? Could a man ever truly return home after facing the brutalities of battle? The aftermath wasn't just about the survivors, it was also about the fallen, the bodies of the dead piled up on the battlefield, left to rot in the open air, an eerie reminder of the price of war. For some battles, there were no time for proper burial, no reverence for the fallen. Soldiers who once fought side by side were reduced to nameless corpses, scattered across the land. The logistics of dealing with the dead were a nightmare. In the heat of battle, survival was the only concern. But after the fighting stopped, Someone had to deal with the consequences, the gruesome work of collecting and disposing of the dead. And then there were the prisoners of war. The fate of those captured was often a dark and uncertain one. Some were ransomed, others executed. The captured could be used for labor, or they might be put on display as trophies of war. For the victors, prisoners were a symbol of their strength, but for the captives, they represented a loss of dignity, of everything they had once held dear. The conditions in which prisoners were held were often brutal, with little regard for their survival. Many died in captivity, their lives snuffed out by disease, hunger, or the cruelty of their captors. But the consequences of war reached beyond the battlefield. Entire communities were torn apart by the conflict. Villages were burned to the ground, families were displaced, and resources were drained. The social fabric of entire regions was broken. War was not just a matter of winning and losing. It was a cataclysm that could leave entire civilizations in ruins. And for those who survived, the rebuilding process was never truly complete. The scars left by war ran deep, embedded into the very structure of society itself. And so, as the world picked up the pieces after the battle, the true cost of war revealed itself not in the victories or defeats, but in the long-term effects that lingered long after the soldiers had returned home. The emotional toll, the lost lives, and the shattered communities would continue to affect generations. The next chapter will take us deeper into the political consequences of these battles, how medieval warfare reshaped nations, changing the course of history with every stroke of a sword. The price of leadership, the price of survival, and the price of war were all part of a larger, more complex equation, one that would resonate through history for centuries to come. For the men who marched into battle, the clash of swords and the cries of the wounded were not merely part of the battlefield, they were part of a divine plan. Religion, deeply woven into the fabric of medieval life, gave the bloodshed on the battlefield a purpose far beyond conquest. It was not just land, wealth, or power that drove armies into war. It was salvation, and it was religion that cast the act of violence in the light of righteousness. Medieval warfare, especially during the Crusades, was fueled by the idea of a holy war, a war sanctioned by God. Leaders of the time, from kings to bishops, invoked divine authority to rally their armies. They promised that those who fought for the right cause would find favor in God's eyes. The Crusaders, for instance, were not simply soldiers but pilgrims on a divine mission. They fought to reclaim the Holy Land, a task that was considered not only noble but sacred. It was a fight for salvation, where killing could be justified as part of God's will. The battlefield, then, became a stage for a higher purpose, and soldiers weren't merely warriors, they were instruments of divine will. What would it feel like to march into battle, knowing that your every move, your every act of violence, was not only endorsed by your earthly leaders, but also by a higher power? This notion of divine approval added a new layer of fearlessness to the warriors. To kill for God, to sacrifice for salvation, made war feel less like destruction and more like a righteous duty. Soldiers were not simply facing physical danger. They were undertaking a spiritual mission, one that could lead to eternal reward. But the relationship between religion and warfare was complex. While the soldiers were promised spiritual glory, the reality of their experiences often left them questioning their faith. The brutality of the battle, the innocent lives lost, the bodies of comrades torn apart, how could this be God's will? And yet, the religious leaders, often speaking from the safety of their pulpits, continued to justify the violence, framing it as a battle between the forces of good and evil. The Crusades were just one example of how religion shaped warfare. It wasn't limited to the Holy Land. Even in local conflicts, religious leaders found ways to align their cause with divine approval. The belief that war could be a means of spiritual purification was pervasive. For a soldier, the battlefield was not just a place of conflict. It was a battleground between light and darkness, good and evil. But did the promise of divine favor ever truly mitigate the horrors they faced? For some, it did. For others, It was a burden too heavy to bear. This divine purpose behind the violence would seep into every corner of medieval warfare, influencing everything from the rallying of soldiers to the actions of the leaders who commanded them. As the battle cries echoed in the distance, the next challenge was not just physical, it was supernatural. How did soldiers protect themselves? And how did their beliefs shape their actions in the face of unimaginable odds? In the next section, we will explore the role of superstition and how these soldiers turned to the unseen forces of the world for strength and guidance. In the harsh and unpredictable world of medieval warfare, soldiers often turn not just to their swords and shields for protection, but to the unseen forces that seem to govern fate itself. Superstition was as much a part of the soldier's arsenal as any weapon. From omens seen in the sky to charms tucked inside their armor, medieval warriors sought divine signs, believing that the outcome of their battles was not merely decided by strength and strategy, but by forces beyond their comprehension. Imagine a soldier standing on the eve of battle, the air thick with tension, and looking up at the sky, searching for any sign that could guide him. Was that a bird flying in a certain direction? Was the wind blowing from the wrong side? These seemingly random signs could shape the very course of their actions. Some believed that certain animals were sacred, their movements foretelling victory or defeat. A raven flying overhead could be interpreted as a sign of impending death, while a cat seen crossing the path of an army might signal a change in fortune. Soldiers were raised on these beliefs, ingrained with the idea that the gods themselves watched over their fates. It wasn't just omens in the natural world that soldiers relied on. Battle rituals, often steeped in religious practice, became a form of psychological protection. Before facing an enemy, a knight might kneel to pray, asking for God's favor and the strength to fight. These prayers were more than acts of devotion, they were acts of preparation, rituals to steel the mind and calm the heart. The belief in divine intervention, that God might guide the sword or steady the hand, gave soldiers a sense of control in the chaos of battle. But not all forms of superstition were so overtly religious. Warriors often carried charms or relics with them, objects imbued with supposed magical properties. These could range from holy relics such as pieces of the true cross, to more local and personal charms believed to ward off evil or bring good luck. These items were seen as physical manifestations of protection. In battle, when the chaos reached its peak, a soldier might clutch his charm, believing that it could turn the tide in his favor. The psychological power of superstition cannot be underestimated. It wasn't just about the rituals or the objects, it was about belief. The mind in the heat of battle is a fragile thing. Fear, doubt, and uncertainty swirl within it. Superstition provided a means to combat those emotions, offering soldiers a sense of purpose, security, and hope in the midst of impending violence. Whether it was the belief that their prayers had been answered, or that an omen had signaled their victory, these beliefs were essential in keeping the soldiers grounded, their spirits fortified against the terror that awaited them. The role of superstition in battle was a form of psychological warfare in its own right. The mere sight of an enemy soldier wearing a blessed charm could invoke fear, the belief that they were somehow protected, invincible even. In such an environment, belief became a weapon, just as real as any sword or spear. The power of these omens and rituals shaped not only the soldier's mindset, but also the way wars were fought, from the planning stages to the actual engagement. With all these beliefs influencing the battlefield, it's not hard to see how religion and superstition were intimately tied to the strategies used in medieval warfare. How did these powerful forces, both spiritual and psychological, help shape the ways in which battles were fought? In the next section, we will explore how these beliefs and practices help justify the moral contradictions of warfare and how they were used by religious leaders to shape the very tactics that determined the fate of entire nations. Medieval warfare was a complex blend of spiritual fervor, moral justification, and cold strategy. At the heart of this was the tension between the ethical dilemmas of war and the religious justification for violence. The Church, which wielded immense power during the Middle Ages, played a significant role in shaping the strategy and conduct of warfare. It not only sanctioned wars but often dictated the terms of engagement, framing them as righteous acts meant to defend the faith or expand the reach of God's kingdom. But what if the moral justification for war was merely an illusion? What if the reasons we were told for waging war, the protection of faith, the purification of the soul, were simply convenient narratives that masked the true nature of the conflict? To many of the soldiers who fought in these wars, the line between divine command and personal ambition was often blurred. Were they fighting for God, or were they fighting for power, land, or revenge? And how could they reconcile the violence they inflicted with the teachings of the very religion they claimed to defend? Consider the Crusades, perhaps the most famous religious wars of the medieval period. The Pope declared the Crusades as holy missions, urging Christians to take up arms in the name of God. Soldiers believed they were fighting for salvation, and many were promised indulgences, temporary pardons for their sins in exchange for their service. This was the moral framework that made these brutal wars not only acceptable but virtuous. Yet, behind the rhetoric of faith, the Crusades were also about power. Kingdoms sought to expand their territories. Warriors sought wealth and glory. The battlefield, then, became a paradox, an arena where the pursuit of holiness coexisted with the pursuit of earthly gain. The Church's involvement didn't end with the call to arms. Religious leaders often played key roles in military strategy, advising kings and commanders on how to fight in accordance with God's will. Some leaders believed that victory in battle was a sign of divine favor, while defeat was seen as punishment for failing to uphold the moral ideals of the faith. These spiritual beliefs, while offering a sense of higher purpose, also placed immense pressure on the leaders of war. The notion that victory was an endorsement from God and that failure was a sign of divine wrath made each battle not just a fight against human opponents, but a confrontation with the very will of God. But what of the moral consequences of war? How could soldiers reconcile the act of killing with their faith? The answer was often found in religious justification. Actions like the massacre of civilians or the use of torture were framed as necessary evils, part of the greater good. The morality of war was shaped by the belief that these actions, however brutal, were part of a divine plan. The Church's influence on warfare was not only strategic but deeply philosophical, pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in the name of faith. As battles were fought in the name of God, the strategies employed in these wars often had a dual purpose: physical conquest and spiritual purification. Wars were not just fought to conquer, they were fought to cleanse. The tactics used, whether in the form of surprise attacks, sieging cities, or laying waste to entire populations, were meant to instill fear and break the spirit of the enemy, creating a sense of divine power over the enemy's land and soul. This mixture of religion, morality, and strategy shaped the outcome of wars, leaving a legacy that would influence not just medieval warfare but the very fabric of Western civilization. As we move forward, the legacy of these religious wars would have lasting implications, not only on the battlefield, but on the cultures that rose from the ashes of war. In the next chapter, we will explore how medieval warfare went beyond the battlefield, shaping politics, culture, and society in ways that still resonate today. In the turbulent world of medieval warfare, the battlefield was not just a site of physical conflict, but a stage for a much larger struggle, one where the true battle was often fought in the halls of power, behind closed doors, and in the minds of kings and noble families. The wars that raged across Europe were not just about land or gold, they were about something far more elusive: control. Power, influence, and dominance were the true prizes of medieval conflict, and kings understood that war was a tool to shape the future of their kingdoms. The medieval period was defined by the constant shifting of alliances and power. Rulers knew that war was not just fought with swords, but with diplomacy, threats, and deceit. A kingdom could be built or destroyed with a single strategic marriage, a well-timed alliance, or a betrayal by a trusted noble. In this volatile landscape, kings were constantly forced to navigate a maze of political intrigue, where the stakes were nothing less than their reigns and their very lives. Take, for example, the 100 Years' War between England and France. It was a war fought not only with armies but with claims to thrones, territorial ambitions, and the shifting alliances between the two kingdoms. English kings sought to solidify their claim to the French throne, while French rulers fought to maintain their independence and reclaim lost lands. But behind the bloodshed lay a much deeper struggle, a battle for control of the European political landscape. Every victory on the battlefield was tied to the diplomacy of the court, and every defeat had repercussions far beyond the battlefield itself. Kings often had to balance their ambitions with the need to maintain loyalty among their nobles, who, in many cases, controlled vast territories and armies of their own. The delicate dance between loyalty and rebellion, honor and betrayal, defined the success or failure of medieval rulers. A king could win a battle, but lose his kingdom in the process, as rebellion would sometimes spring from within his own court. A single misstep, an unjustly treated vassal, or a poorly managed alliance could unravel years of careful political maneuvering. But war was also a means for kings to solidify their power. It was through military victories that monarchs could assert their dominance and expand their influence. By conquering neighboring kingdoms, they could grow their territories and increase their wealth, further cementing their power. But expansion often came with a price. The larger the kingdom, the more difficult it was to control, and the more enemies it made. Success in warfare could lead to short-term glory, but it also set the stage for the political instability that could follow. This power struggle was not just limited to kings, it stretched to the noble families who held the keys to wealth and influence. The clash of dynasties and the rise and fall of noble houses played out on both the battlefield and the diplomatic stage. The very structure of medieval society, where power was distributed among the landed aristocracy, meant that every war had a ripple effect, shaking the foundations of society at every level. As the political and military landscape evolved, so did the tactics and strategies used in war. But the real power lay not just in the strength of armies, but in the ability to manipulate the political dynamics that surrounded them. The next section will explore how diplomacy became just as vital as weaponry, how kings and rulers used negotiations, alliances, and marriages to secure their power without ever drawing a sword. In the world of medieval warfare, where blood was shed on battlefields and kingdoms rose and fell with the sword, there was an equally crucial, yet often overlooked, battle being fought, one of words, alliances, and subtle maneuvering. Diplomacy, the art of negotiation, became as vital to a king's success as his military strategy. Rulers who understood the intricate dance of diplomacy could secure their position without a single sword being raised. In fact, diplomacy was sometimes the key to a victory without any blood being spilled at all. Medieval diplomacy was a sophisticated and complex web of alliances, marriages, and treaties, all designed to balance power and influence across Europe. Kings and queens knew that securing the loyalty of neighboring rulers could mean the difference between a crushing defeat and a victory. One well-timed alliance could render an enemy's strength irrelevant, while a broken promise could lead to disastrous consequences. In many cases, the fate of kingdoms was sealed not on the battlefield, but in the royal courts, where treaties were signed and promises made, promises that could either hold the peace or ignite a war. One of the most powerful diplomatic tools in medieval times was the arranged marriage. Royal marriages were not just acts of love, they were strategic alliances designed to consolidate power. By marrying off daughters and sons to other noble families or foreign rulers, kings and queens could secure alliances and gain access to new territories, resources, and military support. Take, for example, the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry II of England. This union not only strengthened the English monarchy, but also expanded its influence in France, effectively controlling vast territories on both sides of the English Channel. A single marriage could shift the balance of power across entire regions. But diplomacy was not just about building alliances, it was also about playing enemies against each other. The use of treaties and non-aggression pacts allowed kings to keep their rivals at bay while focusing their efforts on other conflicts. At times, kings would negotiate temporary peace with one enemy while plotting their next move against another. These intricate political plays were often carried out with a calm exterior, even as armies clashed in the distance. Kings and rulers understood that, sometimes, the true power was not in victory, but in the ability to outmaneuver your enemies without ever stepping foot on a battlefield. Yet, diplomacy was not without its dangers. It relied heavily on trust. And in a world where betrayal was common, a poorly executed agreement could lead to disaster. The breaking of a treaty, a diplomatic snub, or a failed marriage could trigger war, often resulting in a costly military campaign to undo the damage. Diplomacy in the medieval world was fragile, built on the shifting sands of politics, alliances, and human nature. As powerful as diplomacy was, it was always balanced by the threat of war. After all, words could only go so far. When diplomacy failed, the sword was often the only recourse. And yet, the skillful use of diplomacy could ensure that the sword was never needed. The next chapter will explore how these diplomatic strategies, combined with military might, contributed to the eventual collapse of empires. The rise and fall of these great kingdoms were not just shaped by the battles they fought, but by the diplomatic games they played. In the wake of warfare, it's easy to focus on the immediate losses, the soldiers who fell, the castles that burned, and the blood that stained the earth. But the true cost of war often extends far beyond the battlefield. Empires and kingdoms were built on the backs of wars fought for territory, power, and control. But the same wars that expanded empires also sowed the seeds of their destruction. The collapse of medieval kingdoms wasn't just the result of military defeats. It was a culmination of political instability, economic strain, and the social upheaval caused by prolonged conflict. Take the fall of the Byzantine Empire, for example. The once great empire, which had stood for over 1,000 years, was slowly eroded by continuous wars with neighboring powers and internal strife. As the empire expanded its borders, it spread itself thin, unable to maintain control over its vast territories. Constant warfare drained the empire's resources, weakened its military, and left it vulnerable to invasions from both the east and the west. By the time the Ottomans finally brought the Byzantine Empire to its knees in 1453, the once mighty empire had already been bleeding for centuries. Similarly, the Kingdom of France, during and after the 100 Years' War, faced a series of internal and external struggles that left it fractured and vulnerable. The long conflict with England drained France's resources, leaving the country financially crippled. When the war ended, France was left with a weakened economy, a demoralized populace, and a fractured nobility, all of which contributed to the political instability that would eventually lead to the French Revolution centuries later. The collapse of these kingdoms wasn't just the result of military defeat, it was the accumulation of years of constant warfare, which stretched the limits of their political and military systems. War had a way of exposing the fragility of empires. As kingdoms expanded their borders, they also expanded their enemies. The more land they conquered, the more territory they had to defend. This required a steady supply of soldiers, resources, and leadership. But when wars dragged on for too long, these empires often found themselves unable to maintain control over their growing territories. On a societal level, prolonged warfare also created deep divisions within medieval societies. Nobles and monarchs were often at odds with one another, jockeying for power in the wake of battle. The common people, weary of war, began to question the legitimacy of their rulers. The social structure that had supported medieval kingdoms started to fracture as internal rebellions and peasant uprisings became more frequent. The constant strain of war, combined with the economic hardships it caused, led to widespread discontent among the lower classes, which eventually contributed to the collapse of established political structures. The consequences of prolonged warfare went beyond the loss of territory or the fall of empires. Entire cultures and ways of life were shattered. Once mighty civilizations crumbled under the weight of their own ambitions. As one empire fell, another rose in its place. But the lessons of history were rarely learned. The collapse of these great medieval powers would echo through history, reshaping the future of Europe and the world for centuries to come. As we move forward, we'll examine how these cycles of rise and fall influenced medieval society. The aftermath of war would leave lasting marks on class structures, economic systems, and the very fabric of the medieval world. In the next chapter, we'll see how the effects of warfare extended far beyond the battlefield, reshaping not just empires, but entire civilizations. The medieval world was not simply defined by the brutal battles that scarred its landscapes. It was also shaped by the intricate social structures that held kingdoms together. At the heart of this system was feudalism, a rigid hierarchy where power flowed from the top down, and every individual had their place in the vast machinery of society. This hierarchy, however, was not just a structure of governance. It was a direct product of the wars that ravaged the land, a structure that reinforced the division between the ruling elite and the common people, with war acting as both a tool and a consequence of that division. At the top of this pyramid sat the king or monarch, the figurehead of the realm, supposedly divinely appointed to rule. Beneath him were the lords and barons, landowners, whose wealth and power were measured by the size of their estates and the number of soldiers they could muster for the king's wars. These lords controlled vast swathes of land and were responsible for providing the king with troops, often by calling on vassals and peasants to fight. Their wealth, built on the backs of the labouring classes, was secured by their control over the land that was constantly threatened by the looming spectre of warfare. To maintain their status, they had to ensure the loyalty of their vassals, protect their territories, and fight in the wars that were inevitable for any ruler who wished to retain power. But it was not just the nobility who felt the impact of war. War shaped the very lives of the common people. At the bottom of the feudal ladder were the peasants and serfs, bound to the land and under the control of their lords. For them, the feudal system was not a distant structure. It was their reality. The peasants worked the fields, produced the food, and maintained the lands for the benefit of the higher classes. Their lives were dictated by the whims of their lords, and in times of war, they were often forced to leave their homes and fight in battles they didn't understand, for causes they couldn't control. The cost of war for the peasants was often one of misery, starvation, and death. But even the knights and soldiers, those who were trained for battle, didn't escape the harshness of feudal society. They too were bound by their obligations to their lords, expected to fight in exchange for land or titles. Their loyalty was to their lord, and their duty was to the battlefield. But while knights had a certain level of prestige and protection, they were not exempt from the brutality of war. Their fate often depended on the whims of their rulers, just as much as the fate of the common peasants. In this way, war helped solidify and maintain the divisions within medieval society. The rich, the powerful, and the nobility used war to further their status, while the poor, the peasants, and the soldiers were left to suffer the consequences. The feudal system became an unyielding structure that war continually reinforced its hierarchies and divisions solidified with each new conflict. What if, as we look at the lives of the common soldiers and peasants, we realize that the true battles were not just fought on the fields but in the very structure of society itself? The next section will take us deeper into the lives of these common soldiers, those caught in the machinery of war, caught between duty, fear, and survival. To understand the true cost of medieval warfare, we must turn our attention to those who fought not as knights or lords, but as common soldiers, often conscripted or compelled to take up arms in battles that were far beyond their control. These men, who made up the bulk of medieval armies, lived lives that were defined by hardship, fear, and often an almost unbearable sense of duty. The life of a common soldier was one of unpredictability and discomfort. These men were not trained warriors, but rather peasants or tradesmen who were forced into military service, often with little preparation. They were paid meagre wages, often not enough to cover their basic needs, and given minimal equipment. Their armor was crude, their weapons unreliable, and their chances of survival in battle slim. Imagine the feeling of standing on the battlefield, surrounded by men who, like you, were not soldiers by choice but by necessity. The fear must have been palpable, not only of dying but of failing, of being caught in the chaos of battle with no real understanding of how to defend yourself. But for these soldiers, fear was not just a fleeting emotion, it was a constant companion. The reality of war was one of ever-present terror. The battlefield was a place of confusion, where soldiers often didn't know who their enemies were or even where to go. They fought not just for victory, but for survival. The soldiers were not just fighting a physical battle against their enemies. They were fighting a psychological one against their own fears and doubts. For many, the worst part of being a common soldier was the stark reality of the aftermath. Those who survived battle often returned to find their villages ravaged or their families lost. They were expected to pick up their lives as if nothing had changed, but in truth, they were never the same. They had seen too much, felt too much. The mental toll of war, the grief, the guilt, the horror, was something few would ever fully recover from. But the sense of camaraderie among soldiers was also a powerful force. Soldiers depended on each other in ways that went beyond friendship. The bonds formed between men in the heat of battle were often stronger than any other social ties they had. Together, they shared not just the horrors of war but the hope of survival. The brotherhood that formed between soldiers could transcend the horrors of battle, providing a sense of purpose in a world that often seemed devoid of it. What did it really feel like to live in such constant fear, to risk your life for someone else's cause? How did these men endure the brutality of war, knowing that they were expendable, that their lives meant little in the grand scheme of things? In the next section, we'll explore how the very suffering of these soldiers sparked rebellion, how their struggles gave birth to resistance movements that sought to challenge the very system that had sent them to war. The brutal realities of medieval warfare did not go unnoticed. As the ruling elite sent their soldiers off to fight, the common people, those who bore the brunt of war's consequences, began to question their place in the system. Over time, frustration and anger boiled over, giving birth to uprisings, revolts, and resistance movements that would shake the very foundations of medieval society. The Peasants' Revolt of 1,381 inches. England is perhaps one of the most famous examples of resistance to the feudal system. The peasants, long oppressed by their lords and caught in the vicious cycle of poverty and war, rose up in a desperate attempt to claim their rights. The revolt was sparked by a combination of factors: the heavy taxation imposed to fund ongoing wars, the increasing pressure of the feudal system, and the ever-present threat of violence. The peasants had suffered for too long, and now they were fighting back. What happened when the oppressed decided to fight back? The peasants' revolt wasn't just a protest, it was an act of defiance, a violent rejection of the system that had kept them in servitude. Led by figures like Wat Tyler, the rebels marched on London, demanding lower taxes and an end to serfdom. While the revolt was ultimately suppressed, it was a powerful reminder of the dissatisfaction brewing among the lower classes. For the first time, the peasants demonstrated that they could challenge the authority of their lords. But the revolt was not an isolated event. Throughout medieval Europe, resistance movements sprang up in response to the harsh realities of war. In France, for instance, peasants and soldiers alike revolted against the constant demands of the nobility. In the Holy Roman Empire, the rise of the Hussite Wars was driven by both religious and social discontent, where the common people rallied under the banner of reform. These movements were fueled by the same resentment that had driven soldiers to rebel: the feeling of being exploited, the knowledge that they were mere pawns in a game they had no control over. These uprisings were not just about improving conditions, they were about challenging the entire structure of medieval society. They were about rejecting the idea that the lives of the common people were expendable, that they existed solely to serve the whims of the wealthy and powerful. The resistance movements were an attempt to reclaim agency, to say that the cycle of war and oppression could be broken. The effects of these rebellions were profound. While many were crushed, they planted the seeds for future societal changes. Over time, as the medieval world moved toward the Renaissance and early modern period, the power dynamics began to shift. The ruling elite could no longer ignore the growing discontent among the common people. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the struggles of the lower classes, combined with the evolving nature of warfare, led to innovations in military tactics and strategies. The very structure of medieval society, reinforced by war, was starting to unravel, and new systems of power, leadership, and warfare would rise in its place. In the world of medieval warfare, the true test of a fortress wasn't just its ability to withstand a direct assault. It was the strength of its walls against the tools of siege. Early medieval warfare was dominated by traditional methods of direct confrontation, where the clash of swords and the strategies of mounted knights reigned supreme. But as the need to break through the increasingly formidable defenses of castles and walled cities grew, so too did the innovation in weaponry. The introduction of siege engines revolutionized warfare, making previously impregnable fortresses vulnerable to devastating attacks. Imagine standing atop the high walls of a castle, looking down at the enemy forces below, certain of your fortress's invulnerability. Then, the first sound of a massive stone hitting the wall shatters the air. What you had once thought impregnable begins to tremble. The catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams were the weapons that turned the tide of siege warfare, bringing about a new era where defense no longer guaranteed safety. The catapult was one of the earliest siege weapons, designed to hurl large stones or burning projectiles over the walls. These engines were the forebears of even more destructive devices, but it was the trebuchet that would come to dominate the battlefield. With its powerful counterweight, it could launch huge boulders with incredible force, capable of breaking through the thickest of walls or setting entire sections of a castle aflame. The trebuchet became not only a weapon of destruction but one of psychological warfare, as the terrifying sound of its release could break the spirit of even the most determined defenders. Battering rams, another key component of medieval siege tactics, were used to break down gates and walls. These massive, reinforced wooden structures were often hung with a large, heavy head that could smash through doors with brutal force. Often, soldiers would hide behind the ram, using it as a shield while attempting to break open the gates. The battering ram was an intimate weapon of warfare, where every strike could bring both victory and death in a matter of moments. These siege engines weren't just tools of destruction, they were weapons of fear. The sight of a towering trebuchet or a hammering battering ram was enough to sap the will of defenders, who faced not just an enemy, but an unstoppable force. As each massive stone or battering ram struck its target, it sent a message louder than any battle cry: this fortress could fall. What made siege warfare so revolutionary wasn't just the physical destruction it wrought, it was the way it reshaped the very strategy of war. A fortress that once stood as a symbol of power and security could be reduced to rubble, its defenders helpless in the face of overwhelming technological innovation. As these engines of war grew more sophisticated, so too did the methods of defense, leading to a dynamic arms race that would shape the future of both offensive and defensive tactics. This shift in warfare marked the beginning of a new age, one where the walls meant to protect kingdoms could also become the instruments of their undoing. As these offensive technologies evolved, so too did the methods to counter them. In the next section, we will explore the countermeasures and defensive innovations that emerged in response to the terrifying power of siege warfare. The relationship between offense and defense became a delicate balance, with each side trying to outsmart the other through innovation and strategy. As the evolution of siege technology brought new threats to medieval fortifications, another shift in military strategy was taking place on the open battlefield. Armored cavalry, particularly knights, emerged as the dominant force in medieval warfare. The development of better armor, faster horses, and more sophisticated tactics made mounted combat a crucial element of military success. The knight's charge was more than just a tactic. It was a symbol of power, fear, and superiority on the battlefield. The rise of armored cavalry transformed the way wars were fought. The knight, clad in shining plate armor and riding a powerful steed, became the most feared force in any medieval army. The knight's charge could break enemy lines with devastating effect. But what made this charge so unstoppable was not just the strength of the knight or the speed of his horse, it was the strategy behind it. Knights were trained to fight in tight formations, creating shockwaves through enemy lines, often causing confusion and disarray. The development of better armor played a key role in the knight's effectiveness. Early medieval armor consisted of simple leather and chainmail, which provided some protection but was often ineffective against more powerful weapons. However, as armor technology advanced, knights began to wear full plate armor, offering near impenetrable protection against arrows, swords, and spears. This made the knight a nearly invulnerable force on the battlefield, capable of charging headlong into the enemy and striking with deadly precision. But the true strength of mounted knights lay not just in their individual prowess, but in their strategic use on the battlefield. Armored cavalry was used to break through enemy lines, flank opposing infantry, and chase down retreating soldiers. The psychological impact of a cavalry charge was immense. Infantry would often scatter at the sight of knights charging toward them, their heavy armor and disciplined formations creating a sense of unstoppable force. Yet, while the knight's charge was devastating, it also required careful coordination and timing. Knights had to rely on their commanders to give the right signals at the right time. The cavalry was powerful, but it was not invincible. It could be countered by disciplined infantry formations or well-positioned archers. The cavalry's dominance on the battlefield was not a given. It was the result of a well-coordinated effort, one that relied heavily on the knight's training, the strength of his horse, and the strategic placement of his forces. As knights and armored cavalry dominated the battlefields, defenders had to develop new ways to resist their might. The evolution of battlefield tactics specifically designed to counter cavalry was one of the driving forces behind the development of medieval fortifications and military strategies. The next section will delve into the advancements in defensive warfare, exploring how castles, walls, and fortifications were redesigned to resist the cavalry charge and the new offensive technologies that accompanied it. While the evolution of offensive technologies in medieval warfare brought terrifying new tools of destruction, the defenders of kingdoms were not without their own innovations. In response to the increasing power of siege engines and the devastating cavalry charge, the art of defensive warfare advanced just as rapidly, leading to the creation of some of the most impressive fortifications the world has ever seen. Castles, walls, and moats. These were not just symbols of power, they were the last line of defense between kingdoms and their enemies. The rise of siege engines like the trebuchet and the battering ram meant that defenders could no longer rely solely on simple stone walls or wooden palisades. To withstand the power of these siege weapons, castles had to evolve. The development of thicker walls, higher towers, and reinforced gates became a standard part of defensive architecture. The walls were often built with layers of stone and earth, designed to absorb the impact of siege weapons. In many cases, the walls were also angled outward to deflect the force of projectiles, making them harder to breach. But fortifications were not just about physical strength, they were also about strategic placement. Castles were often built on high ground or near natural barriers like rivers, making them harder to attack. Moats, for example, became a critical part of castle defences. These water-filled trenches acted as both a physical barrier and a psychological one, slowing down attackers and making it more difficult for siege engines to reach the castle walls. The sight of a deep, murky moat surrounding a castle was often enough to deter would-be invaders, who knew that crossing it would be no easy task. Inside the walls, castles were designed with both defence and comfort in mind. Garrisons, small units of soldiers stationed within the fortifications, were strategically placed to ensure that defenders could repel any assault. The layout of the castle allowed defenders to fight back from multiple points, giving them the upper hand in a siege. Narrow windows for archers, traps for invaders, and even secret passageways were all part of the defensive design that made castles so formidable. However, as siege weapons became more advanced, even the most powerful castles began to show signs of vulnerability. The development of gunpowder and early cannons eventually rendered many medieval fortifications obsolete. What had once been the pinnacle of defensive design now had its limits. The very walls that were built to protect kingdoms could become their undoing, as new weapons arrived that could tear down even the strongest defenses. The defensive advancements made during the medieval period were a testament to human ingenuity, but they also underscored the cyclical nature of warfare. Each new offensive weapon was met with a countermeasure, each defensive innovation was met with an offensive response. This constant arms race between offense and defense would continue for centuries, shaping the course of history. In the next chapter, we will explore how these technological advancements in both offense and defense affected the outcome of battles and the long-term political consequences of medieval warfare. The evolution of military technology was not just about winning battles. It was about changing the way societies were structured and how kingdoms were governed. The impact of these advancements would be felt long after the final siege engines were dismantled. In the shadow of medieval warfare, where the clash of arms often determined the fate of entire kingdoms, there arose a set of ideals that would shape the conduct of warriors for centuries. This was the code of chivalry, a strict moral and ethical code that governed the actions of knights and noble warriors. While it was born out of the brutality of war, chivalry introduced an order of honor that elevated the role of the knight beyond that of a mere fighter. The knights became not only warriors, but symbols of a higher standard of behavior, protectors of the weak, defenders of the faith, and upholders of justice. What if the greatest warriors weren't just defined by their skill in battle, but by their adherence to a code of honor? The chivalric code, with its values of bravery, loyalty, and courtesy, was meant to bring nobility and morality into a world otherwise governed by bloodshed. It governed everything from how battles were fought to the treatment of prisoners. A knight's success was not only measured by his victories on the battlefield, but by how well he adhered to these principles. Knights were expected to demonstrate courage, respect for women and the weak, and above all, loyalty to their lord and fellow warriors. The chivalric code had a profound influence on how battles were fought. For example, it dictated that knights should fight with honor, which sometimes meant showing mercy to a defeated opponent or sparing civilians from harm. In an age when warfare was often brutal and merciless, this principle of honor provided a sense of order amid the chaos. Knights were expected to engage in one-on-one combat, rather than resorting to underhanded tactics or ambushes. This was seen as not just a form of fair play, but as a reflection of their personal integrity. However, this code was not just about noble ideals. It was also tied to the societal structure of the time. The chivalric code was a tool used by the aristocracy to maintain their power over the lower classes. The knights, as enforcers of this code, were often seen as the ideal representatives of the feudal order. The very concept of nobility was intertwined with the martial virtues of chivalry. Knights were more than soldiers, they were an extension of the feudal hierarchy, expected to uphold the social order through their actions, both in and out of battle. But the chivalric code wasn't without its contradictions. While it preached honor, it also justified violence, often in the name of religion or conquest. Knights could claim divine approval for their actions, believing that their wars, whether against heathens or rivals, were ordained by God. The notion that war could be both a noble cause and an instrument of divine will complicated the morality of medieval warfare, leading to a world where honor and brutality often coexisted. As the code of chivalry became more ingrained in medieval society, it began to influence not only warriors but also the wider culture. The ideals of bravery, loyalty, and justice became part of the broader cultural fabric, shaping how societies viewed heroism and warfare. The knight, as both a warrior and a moral figure, became a symbol of the medieval world's complex relationship with war. But how did these ideals affect the broader cultural landscape, particularly in art and literature? The next section will delve into the profound impact of medieval warfare on the world of art and storytelling, where the stories of valor, sacrifice, and chivalry were immortalized for generations to come. The blood-soaked battlefields of medieval warfare were not just remembered in the hearts of soldiers and nobles, they were immortalized in the very fabric of the culture itself. The stories of valor, heroism, and sacrifice were woven into the art and literature of the time, creating a cultural legacy that would resonate for centuries. The chivalric ideals that were cultivated in the crucible of war found their way into the pages of epic poems, the strokes of illuminated manuscripts, and the grand tapestries that told tales of knights and battles fought for honor and glory. What if the greatest battles of medieval history were not just fought on the field, but immortalized in tales and paintings? One of the most iconic examples of this is the Times Song of Roland, *, a French epic that recounts the heroism and tragic death of the knight Roland, who fights to protect his king and country. The Times Song of Roland Times is a celebration of the knightly virtues, bravery, loyalty, and sacrifice. The story elevated the warrior into a figure of moral purity, even as it explored the brutal consequences of war. It was not just a battle between armies, it was a battle for the soul of a knight, for his honor and his fate. Similarly, the Arthurian legends, which have captivated imaginations for centuries, framed the knightly code in terms of mystical adventure, divine justice, and personal sacrifice. The Knights of the Round Table figures like Lancelot, Gawain, and Galahad embodied the ideals of chivalry. These stories, although set in a mythical past, were deeply rooted in the values of medieval warfare. The knights were warriors, yes, but they were also bound by a moral code that transcended the battlefield. They fought not just for land or power, but for higher ideals, the protection of the weak, the defense of the faith, and the pursuit of justice. These tales were not confined to written stories. The imagery of knights and battles permeated medieval art, particularly illuminated manuscripts and tapestries. Artists depicted grand battles, often blurring the line between historical events and the romanticized world of chivalric warfare. The depiction of knights in full armor, charging into battle with banners raised, became a symbol of not only military might but of moral virtue. These artworks, created for both religious and secular patrons, reflected the dual nature of warfare in medieval society, its violence and its sanctity. But what was the deeper significance of this artistic and literary focus on war? In many ways, it shaped the medieval worldview, glorifying the knightly virtues and solidifying the idea of war as both a necessity and a moral endeavor. The battlefield was no longer just a place of death and destruction. It became a stage for the heroic struggle of good against evil, of light against darkness. This romanticized vision of warfare would influence both the rulers who waged it and the common people who were caught in its wake. As these stories and images of war shaped cultural identity, they also set the stage for a broader transformation in European society. The values that were glorified in the stories of knights and battles would eventually contribute to the political and cultural shifts that marked the end of the medieval period. The legacy of medieval warfare, seen in art and literature, was a precursor to the dramatic changes that would give birth to the Renaissance. In the next section, we'll explore how the prolonged warfare of the medieval era eventually gave way to a new age, a time when new ideas, art, and scientific discovery would flourish in the wake of centuries of bloodshed. The medieval period, with its chivalric ideals, its brutal warfare, and its feudal structures, began to fade as the world transitioned into a new era. The bloodshed of the medieval age, from the Crusades to the 100 Years' War, had left Europe in turmoil. But from the ashes of these conflicts arose something new, something that would reshape the course of history forever. This was the dawn of the Renaissance, a period of profound cultural, intellectual, and artistic transformation. What if the bloodshed of the medieval era led to the birth of a new world? After centuries of devastating warfare, the economic, political, and social systems that had sustained medieval society began to unravel. The constant state of warfare had drained resources, destabilized kingdoms, and fragmented empires. Yet, this very destruction created the conditions for a renaissance of human thought. As medieval kingdoms fell into decline, new ideas, innovations, and philosophies began to emerge, fueled by the desire to rebuild and redefine the world. The end of the medieval period was marked by significant shifts in both the political and cultural landscape. The decline of feudalism, the rise of nation-states, and the growing power of the merchant class all played a role in the transformation. The brutal wars of the medieval period had created a vacuum in which new forms of governance, economics, and culture could flourish. The intellectual fervor of the Renaissance, with its emphasis on humanism and the rediscovery of classical knowledge, became the driving force of the era. But the Renaissance wasn't just a cultural rebirth, it was also a direct response to the devastation of medieval warfare. The horrors of war, coupled with the collapse of old systems, created a desire for progress and renewal. As people began to question the old ways of thinking, they sought new ideas in art, science, and philosophy. The devastation of war led to a re-evaluation of the very nature of human existence, and this re-examination would fuel the discoveries and innovations that defined the Renaissance. The political consequences of medieval warfare also played a pivotal role in shaping the Renaissance. The rise of powerful monarchies, the centralization of political power, and the decline of feudalism set the stage for a new social order. The monarchs who emerged from the rubble of medieval conflict were not just warriors. They were patrons of the arts, supporters of learning, and proponents of a new worldview that valued reason and creativity. The long-term legacy of medieval warfare was not just seen in the shifting power structures, it was embedded in the cultural fabric of Renaissance society. The themes of chivalry, heroism, and sacrifice, which had been glorified in medieval art and literature, now found new expression in the works of Renaissance artists and writers. The knight, once the central figure of medieval warfare, gave way to new heroes, figures like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Niccolò Machiavelli, who embodied the ideals of human potential and intellectual exploration. As the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance, the violence and chaos of war were replaced by an intellectual and artistic awakening. But the echoes of medieval warfare would continue to reverberate through history, shaping the future of both military tactics and the cultures that emerged in its wake. The long shadow of the medieval world, with its wars, its ideals, and its struggles, would continue to influence the trajectory of Western civilization, even as the Renaissance ushered in a new age of enlightenment and discovery. This cultural shift, spurred by the lingering effects of medieval warfare, marks the transition from a world defined by constant conflict to one that sought meaning, knowledge, and beauty in the aftermath of destruction. As we move forward, we will examine how these cultural shifts, combined with the legacy of medieval warfare, helped shape the modern world. The passage of time has a way of obscuring the lessons of history, but when it comes to military strategy, the echoes of medieval warfare still resonate in modern combat. While weapons and technology have evolved beyond the imaginations of medieval tacticians, the core principles of strategy, battlefield tactics, and the use of cavalry have left a lasting mark on how wars are fought today. In many ways, the battlefield practices of the medieval era laid the groundwork for the combat strategies we see in modern warfare, showing that the fundamentals of war have changed little, even as the tools of war have advanced beyond recognition. What if the tactics that won medieval battles are still used today? The essence of medieval battle strategies, such as the use of flanking maneuvers, the importance of strategic positioning, and the coordination of infantry with mounted cavalry, can still be seen in modern military operations. In particular, the cavalry, once the shock force of medieval armies, is echoed today in modern mechanized units, like tanks and armored divisions. These units, like their medieval predecessors, are used to break enemy lines and create chaos in the enemy's rear, ensuring that the rest of the army can advance or encircle the opposition. The idea of using speed and maneuverability to disorient and disrupt remains a core tactic in modern combat. Siege warfare, too, has influenced modern military thought. The idea of surrounding and isolating an enemy in a fortified position, cutting off supply lines, and forcing them into submission is still used in modern warfare. Whether it's the use of airstrikes to target infrastructure, or the modern concept of a siege in urban warfare, the principles of medieval siege tactics, such as the strategic use of artillery and the gradual weakening of enemy defences, are remarkably similar to their medieval counterparts. However, one of the most enduring legacies of medieval warfare lies in the chivalric code that governed the actions of knights and soldiers. While modern armies no longer operate under a rigid code of honour, elements of medieval ethics have seeped into military practices, particularly in terms of conduct during wartime. The concept of just war, which gained prominence during the medieval period, continues to influence how modern armies justify their actions and treat prisoners of war. The moral dilemmas that medieval knights faced fighting for honour while adhering to codes of conduct can still be seen in the rules of engagement and modern military ethics. The tactical lessons of medieval warfare continue to guide military leaders today, and the enduring influence of cavalry and siege strategies can still be found on modern battlefields. But this connection to the past is not just about tactics, it's about a broader cultural and philosophical legacy that continues to shape how we view war and heroism. The next section will explore the mythic figure of the medieval knight, the romanticized version of warriors that continues to captivate modern imaginations, and how this myth distorts our understanding of the brutal reality of medieval combat. For centuries, the image of the knight has been immortalized in literature, art, and popular culture as the epitome of honor, courage, and chivalry. From the pages of Arthurian legend to the epic poems of medieval warriors, the knight has come to symbolize the highest ideals of heroism, selflessness, and virtue. Yet, what if the noble knight, immortalized in art and story, is nothing like the soldiers who fought the real battles? The truth is, the reality of medieval warfare was far from the romanticized image we hold today. Medieval knights were, by and large, professional soldiers, bound by their duty to their lords, expected to fight not for noble ideals, but for land, power, and survival. The harsh conditions of medieval combat, the fear of death, the constant threat of injury, and the often arbitrary violence of battle were far removed from the noble ideals of honour and gallantry. Knights, while skilled warriors, were often as brutal and ruthless as the enemies they fought, their valour sometimes only a veneer for the ruthless realities of war. Yet, despite this contrast, the knight's image has endured as a symbol of a moral and just warrior. The concept of chivalry, with its emphasis on personal honour, loyalty, and a sense of duty to the kingdom and the weak, was enshrined in the literature and art of the time. But over time, these stories took on a life of their own, becoming myths that were passed down through generations, shaping our cultural memory of the medieval era. The knight became an archetype, one that could be moulded to fit a variety of heroic roles, from the faithful defender of the helpless to the valiant crusader on a divine mission. The enduring popularity of these myths can be seen in the continued fascination with medieval warriors in modern media. From films like Time's Excalibur Times to video games like Time's The Witcher Times and Time's Dark Souls ***, the image of the knight continues to captivate audiences. These modern portrayals often take liberties with history, casting knights as near-mythical figures who fight for honour, glory, and justice. In doing so, they perpetuate the idea of the knight as a noble and virtuous figure, reinforcing a myth that bears little resemblance to the often brutal reality of medieval combat. This mythologizing of the medieval knight has profound implications for how we view the past. By romanticizing the figure of the knight, we distort our understanding of medieval warfare and the realities of the men who fought in these wars. We overlook the suffering, the fear, and the sacrifice that were part of daily life for soldiers during this period. Yet, the enduring myth of the knight continues to shape our cultural imagination, offering a vision of a simpler, more heroic time. A vision that, while compelling, can never fully capture the complexity of medieval warfare. As we begin to deconstruct the myths surrounding the medieval warrior, we must also reflect on the nature of war itself. In the next section, we'll explore the deeper philosophical questions surrounding war, asking whether it is an eternal part of human nature and what we can learn from the battles of the medieval period that continue to shape the conflicts we face today. War has always been an integral part of human history, a constant against which civilizations have built, fought, and ultimately collapsed. From the ancient empires to the modern world, conflict has been an inescapable aspect of human existence. Medieval warfare, with its brutality and complexity, offers a lens through which we can reflect on the larger human experience with violence, survival, and the pursuit of power. What if the medieval battles we study today are not just remnants of a distant past, but reflections of timeless patterns in human behavior? Is war an eternal part of human nature, woven into the fabric of who we are? The nature of medieval warfare reveals a profound truth about humanity. War is not just about power or resources, it is also about identity, belief, and survival. In medieval times, battles were not just fought for land or riches. They were fought to defend honor, uphold religion, and preserve the cultural order. The lines between the political, the spiritual, and the personal were blurred in ways that made war both a necessity and a tragedy. What we see in the medieval period is the intersection of conflicting human instincts, the need for survival, the desire for dominance, and the drive to uphold one's values, even if it meant plunging entire societies into violence. The brutal realities of medieval combat, its unpredictability, its bloodshed, and its destruction mirrored the fears and anxieties of medieval society. For those who fought in these wars, there was no clean distinction between good and evil. The concept of a just war was often invoked, but the moral justification for conflict was rarely as clear-cut as it appeared. In many ways, the medieval world was one where survival, faith, and political power were inextricably linked, each feeding off the other in a never-ending cycle of violence. But as we look at the long history of warfare, we must also ask, what lessons can we learn from the medieval period? What can the wars fought so long ago teach us about the conflicts we face today? The truth is, the nature of war has not changed as much as we might like to think. While technology has transformed the weapons we use, the strategies we employ, and the scale of the destruction we can inflict, the human cost of war remains as high as ever. Whether it's the medieval battlefield, World War I, or modern conflicts in the Middle East, the underlying dynamics of warfare, fear, power, survival, and morality remain constant. In many ways, medieval warfare serves as a microcosm of the larger human experience with conflict. It shows us that war is not just a series of battles fought by soldiers, but a reflection of the struggles within us, all the struggle between life and death, between loyalty and betrayal, between ideals and the harsh reality of survival. As we look back at these ancient battles, we can see how the patterns of war have shaped the modern world, not just through the advancement of military tactics, but in the cultural, social, and ethical dimensions of conflict. Ultimately, the question we must confront is whether war, in any form, is an inevitable part of human nature. Is the violence that defines so much of our history simply a reflection of our deepest instincts, a constant cycle that we are doomed to repeat? As we move forward into the future, we must confront these questions, understanding that the legacy of medieval warfare, its brutality, its heroism, and its moral complexities will continue to influence how we fight wars and how we understand ourselves as a species. As we conclude this exploration, we are left to reflect on how the past shapes the present and the future. The medieval era, with all its triumphs and tragedies, has left a profound mark on the way we view war, power, and heroism. And as we move into a world of ever-evolving conflict, the lessons of the medieval period, both its brilliance and its horrors, remain as relevant as ever. When we think of warfare, the immediate image is often one of battles fought, blood spilled, and enemies defeated. But the true, long-lasting legacy of medieval warfare lies not only in the combat, but in the scars it left on both individuals and societies. The medieval period was one of constant conflict wars between kings, knights, and empires. And while the battles raged on, their effects rippled through the very fabric of society, leaving emotional, physical, and societal scars that would last for generations. What if the true legacy of medieval warfare isn't in the battles fought, but in the scars it left on the world? The trauma of war wasn't just a personal burden for the soldiers on the front lines. It was deeply woven into the social, political, and cultural landscape of the time. Families were torn apart, entire villages wiped out, and societies destabilized as the cycle of war continued. The mental toll on soldiers survivors of battle, who had witnessed horrors that would haunt them for a lifetime, was as severe as the physical wounds they carried. Yet, these traumas were often unacknowledged, leaving soldiers to return home, expected to pick up the pieces of lives that had been shattered by conflict, all while carrying the weight of their own internal struggles. The societal impacts were equally profound. Medieval warfare was not just about conquest and territory. It was about shaping the identity and order of entire regions. The feudal system, strengthened by war, imposed a rigid class structure that created a deep division between the powerful and the powerless. While knights and lords reaped the benefits of war, the common people, whose lives were often lost in the struggle, were left to rebuild in the wake of destruction. The constant cycle of war meant that resources were drained, economies weakened, and once thriving cities were reduced to rubble. Beyond the immediate costs, the legacy of medieval warfare also laid the groundwork for modern understandings of conflict. It was during this time that many of the fundamental tactics and strategies of modern war, such as the use of cavalry, siege warfare, and the integration of diverse military units, were refined. The brutality of medieval warfare also set the stage for the development of modern concepts of military ethics and conduct. The Code of Chivalry, although romanticized, was an early attempt to bring order to the chaos of war. It is the precursor to modern military codes, although the harsh realities of medieval warfare rarely aligned with the ideals of honor and justice that it espoused. As we reflect on the medieval period, we realize that its wars were not just events in history. They were transformative moments that shaped the world we live in today. The pain, suffering, and destruction wrought by medieval warfare left a deep imprint, influencing everything from the development of national identities to the formation of modern military strategies. The ghosts of these wars continue to haunt us, as we still struggle with the same issues of conflict, survival, and the human cost of violence. The scars left by medieval warfare are not just physical, they are emotional, societal, and philosophical, and they persist in shaping our understanding of war and peace. This reflection on the unseen impacts of war brings together the themes we have explored throughout this documentary: the struggle for survival, the evolution of military technology, and the moral complexities of conflict. The next section will delve deeper into the enduring power of survival stories, those personal and collective narratives that continue to resonate today. These stories, forged in the crucible of medieval warfare, offer us insight into the resilience of the human spirit and the power of enduring hope in the face of insurmountable odds. As we come to the conclusion of this journey through the dark and tumultuous world of medieval warfare, it's important to remember that not all stories of war are about victory or conquest. In fact, the most powerful stories to emerge from these turbulent times often have nothing to do with triumph. They are stories of survival, resilience, and the indomitable will to live despite the horrors of war. These narratives, many of which have been passed down through generations, offer a lens through which we can understand the true human cost of conflict. What if the greatest story ever told isn't one of victory, but one of survival against all odds? From the common soldier to the noble knight, The tales of those who endured the ravages of medieval warfare are among the most moving and enduring of human history. These stories are not just about the battles fought, but about the men and women who lived through them, those who suffered loss, fear, and unimaginable hardship, yet somehow found the strength to survive. For soldiers, survival was not a matter of just enduring physical battles. It was about surviving the psychological and emotional toll of war. The medieval battlefield was a place where comrades were lost, trust was broken, and the mind could easily succumb to fear and despair. Yet, amid this chaos, many soldiers found ways to endure, drawing strength from each other, from their faith, or from the idea of something greater than themselves. Their stories of survival were not just about escaping death. They were about maintaining a sense of humanity in a world that seemed to have lost it. But survival stories weren't limited to the soldiers. They extended to the families who waited anxiously at home, to the civilians caught in the crossfire of sieges and raids. Women, often left behind as their husbands and sons marched off to war, endured their own struggles. Many were forced to take on roles that were traditionally reserved for men, managing estates and families, making life and death decisions in the absence of their male counterparts. And when those soldiers returned, often broken or scarred, these women helped them rebuild their lives. Their resilience, too, became part of the collective survival story of medieval warfare. The stories of survival from this era continue to resonate today, not just in the pages of history books, but in the hearts of those who hear them. They serve as a reminder of the fragility of life and the strength of the human spirit. These tales of endurance offer us a glimpse into the lives of those who lived through unimaginable suffering and yet persevered. They remind us that even in the darkest of times, the will to survive can shine through, bringing hope to future generations. In modern times, these survival stories continue to inspire. Whether in literature, film, or personal narratives, the stories of individuals who survived medieval warfare continue to capture our imaginations. They teach us about the resilience of the human spirit, about overcoming adversity, and about the power of hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. These stories, woven into the fabric of our cultural memory, remind us that, even in the darkest times, the fight for survival is not just about physical strength, but about the strength of character and the will to continue. As we close this chapter, we leave the viewer with a powerful reflection. The survival stories of the medieval world, like the wars they were born from, are far from over. They live on in the hearts of those who remember, in the stories we tell, and in the legacy of human endurance. While medieval warfare may have ended centuries ago, the power of survival, resilience, and hope is timeless, and it will continue to inspire us as we navigate the complexities of the modern world. This concluding section ties together the themes of survival, resilience, and the enduring human spirit in the face of adversity, providing a deep, reflective close to the documentary. It leaves the audience with a powerful message about the lasting impact of medieval warfare not just on the battlefield, but on the individuals, societies, and cultures shaped by it.